See David Tulis.
There are some options, as League of the South proposes. There is serfdom, there is revolution, and there is independence. Those are the three geopolitical options that Americans have if they want to be under the subjection of Uncle, who's bankrupt, who has who operates a kind of terror state, a terror and warfare state. Then we can maintain our comfort level in the serfdom category. The other that's also grievous, perhaps equally grievous, is revolution. And revolution is what we have among many people who are being quoted today, who want to overturn things by violence, inviting, of course, the police state, and violence, which of course never brings liberty. Revolutions do not bring greater liberty, do not bring an end of oppression to the working people, which are often the pretended pretended beneficiaries of a revolution. The alternative is independence. Now, independence is, of course, frightening, and that means that there's no HUD anymore, right? There's no food stamp program anymore. There are no solar subsidies from Washington anymore. If you were still filing tax returns in that latter period, you won't get that chit on your paperwork. This is David Tulis, and we are arguing for independence for Chattanooga. Now, if we could be independent Chattanooga, that would be a wonderful thing. Now, there are some people who are thinking in this direction in, I would say, geopolitical, mega economic terms. Dave Crockett, for example, the candidate for mayor, was closest. He was the only candidate who was even remotely close to thinking in this very useful direction, that of the city-state, the independent city-state, like Singapore. Could Chattanooga ever have the wherewithal to plan its steps in that direction? That would be trans-jurisdictional entity, apart from the current boundaries, the current state lines, the current inclusion, perhaps voluntarily in some respects, involuntarily in other respects, inclusion in and under federal hegemony, the federal control of the states, which exists by fear and by subsidy, right? It exists because it has the power of bluff and bully, and also because the people who are rattling their swords trying to complain about it in the name of states' rights and under the proviso of the 10th Amendment, they're not willing really to do anything because they want to keep the money flow coming in for their welfare programs and for their highway budgets and their school lunches. You know, the USDA school lunch program that is so relied upon by the local political establishment that has no free market response to anything. Right? That we have that here. There's not really a free market perspective among office holders. There are a few who do have it, but in their case, it's often just partial and on one point or other. But there's not any kind of comprehensive view among political figures in Hamilton County. So what we want to think about long term is having people who represent that perspective, who are not conservatives, right? That we don't want conservatives taking office. That's the last thing we want. We want people who are, as I am, I propose classical liberals who are for the marketplace as a whole, which implies a disdain, disregard of establishment, government business, right? Where government no longer is commercial government, but government in the negative only. Government that is protective only. Government that doesn't own anything really at all, but protects the ownership of assets held by individuals, held by families, held by trusts, held by companies and businesses and organizations, right? Those are the parties who should be the owners of things, not the government. And because that's the case in the classically liberal perspective, what is a border, right? and the whole right wing, the whole Trump world thinks that we have to have a border. Well, listen, if you have a border that the government controls, then that implies that the government owns all the land within it, right? And the household image analogy is thrown at me sometimes on this point by the right wing here at the radio station. Well, you have a house, right? Don't you want to control who comes and goes in your house? Well, that's because I own the house, and I can control who comes in the door. Well, the government doesn't own the country, right? If it did, then the border would be rational. If the government owned all the land, than to say it should control who comes in the country and who maybe can leave the country and how people should go from state to state, from room to room in the house of the country. Well, then it's reasonable to say that there should be a border and a lock, the key held by Washington. Well, there is no real authority for the border. The border is simply a line that shows the end of authority of that power, right? The state's power, the homeowner's power, who owns the lot there on the border, with its mesquite and its sand, and the house kind of near the little creek there, 2 miles from the border. That house, that man owns the land, and his authority stops at the border, right? And so does the national government's authority stop at the border, right? And the border doesn't mean that it has to be a fort. It doesn't mean that there has to be a wall controlled by Uncle or President Trump or the Congress, right? That's not implied in that at all. That analogy is a false analogy. The government doesn't own the country. The government simply protects the private rights of people in the country to have due process, to be able to have contracts enforced, to have protection from violent injury by private sources. This is David Tulis. And caller, you're live on the air. You've got my ear, caller. What's on your mind?
You knew I was going to call you on this because you're absolutely wrong on this, and we're friends, and we know, but you do not know what you're talking about.
We're not friends,
and I'm going to call you out. And I'm going to try to do this without you cutting me off, because
make it short.
I'm going to read the first part of this, and this is actually, believe it or not, the Constitution. It talks about we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, so on and so forth, for ourselves and our prosperity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. For the United States of America. So we the people established the Constitution for something that already existed. The United States of America. Are we on the same page with this?
I'm listening rapturously.
Okay, you and I both understand that they're legal fictions. We can't see state lines when you cross. These are all legal fictions. And then when people get together and form power, either compel or not compel someone to do something, and then codify that by writing it down and create forces to enforce what the written word is, you have borders. You have individual borders. You have communal borders. You have
city borders,
property borders,
county borders,
and in this case, you have borders that determine what your country is. It's not. The argument is so ridiculous. It's almost a waste of time. Because I mean, look what happened. You keep talking about Israel with no borders. How'd they end up? Or how'd the Indians end up with no borders? They were taken over. The federal government not only has the power, but the authority and the obligation to establish borders. That's their job. And that is to protect us. That's their job, is to protect us from foreign invasion. And I'm just going to throw this at you one more time. Let's say hypothetically in your perfect world, and I'm a libertarian, but I'm a libertarian with constitutionalist foundations. I'm not a liberal lunatic. In your perfect world, there are no borders now. Anybody can come into the country anytime they want. We're not even checking TSA stuff. They can put bombs in and whatever. Right. What would prevent any country from bringing in their aircraft carrier and just letting off their people with guns? Because we have the right to bear arms. And what would prevent China from coming over and just, hey, go ahead. North Korea. Anybody just walk into Canada. I fear Canada invading more than anyone else. We're the most annoying people in the world. And the French, Quebec. Or doesn't it matter? Because we have no national government, so just let everybody in.
Mike, these are just ridiculous proposals. They're just laughable. Come on. Let me ask you a question. Well, Mike, let me ask you a question. Where does sovereignty reside? Sovereignty is claimed by the government of Tennessee. The national government of Washington claims sovereignty as well. Are these true claims or false claims?
Anybody can claim anything, but God, there's only one sovereign, it's God.
Okay.
The federal government of the United States are granted specific limited powers under Article 1, Section 8. The states are denied powers under Article 1, Section 10. These are men in charge. If we don't hold their feet to the fire, they go crazy. That's why Thomas Jefferson said there should be a bloody revolution every 20 years, because men are corrupt. But since people are lazy, they don't hold their feet to the fire. Just because they do something doesn't make it right. But if you don't establish borders, how do you have a country? I mean, how could the founders say we give this Constitution to the United States but didn't exist?
Well, the problem, Mike, is that we have a border which goes hundreds of miles inland, and the good people have roadblocks all through Arizona, all around the country, hundreds of miles inland to check for.
Which I believe it is. They have no constitutional authority to do that beyond the border. Like Washington D.C. is not supposed to be
the power
anything other than a capital.
The power to run these roadblocks inland.
That's a different argument. I agree with you there. You set the borders. You ensure that the borders are secured because you have international treaties to deal with.
Well, let me ask you a question. You're a libertarian, Mike. Do you really want the government to have compulsory police control against and over people who have done nothing wrong, who are innocent, harmless, and innocuous, who've done nothing wrong? Why do you want to have these people under police control? That's what you're proposing. Why?
Give me an example of what you're talking about.
Well, I'm a Mexican. I want to cross the border at Laredo because I have a job in a restaurant in America. Why should I have to go through any kind of control if my activity is harmless, innocent, and purely personal?
How do I know your activity is harmless?
Why do you have to know?
The job of the federal government is to protect that. Is to ensure that those borders are secure. That's their job.
Well, you believe then?
Change the Constitution. That's a whole.
But if I've done nothing wrong, why should there be?
Abolish the Constitution, then we can philosophize on how the world should be, and it would work if everyone was a Christian.
Well, you're proposing.
But if you're talking about modern day America with a Constitution. The federal government absolutely has the power to determine borders. That's settled.
Well, it's settled, but that doesn't mean it's right. And I think what we want to do here on our program, thanks, Mike, for calling, is to make people want to have something that is really an ideal, right? We're proposing things that are not possible right now, but I think the benefit for us is if we yearn for something that isn't possible necessarily now. Yes, the government has power. Indeed, it has all kinds of powers, licit and illicit. But we should want a free and equitable situation where people who are innocent of any crime, who've done nothing wrong, can freely move wherever they want to go. The free market in labor, that's what that's called. And there should not be a border because the border implies an ownership of the territories on this side of that line that the government claims authority and jurisdiction over, and it really does not have that authority except where it has usurped its powers against the people, right? The usurped power always comes from somewhere, and it comes from the American people who are the victims of it. It usurps power from you and from me. The group that's received some flack in the past few days is League of the South. It has a very sane argument. You just have to go to its website, leagueofthesouth.com. And look under essays. There are some very good essays that deal with the questions of decentralization and the question of what I would call the terror state in Washington. Washington is not our protector. Washington is a body that rejects what the League calls ordered Christian liberty. And ordered Christian liberty is, again, a decentralized, common law-oriented society where there are not thousands and thousands of pages of written statutes and rules. In the old common law concept, which you can see even in Tennessee, even in the legal system today, there are many common law concepts which are virtually not known by anybody, but they're there still. For example, the right to travel. That is a common law right, and I've been doing some reading on that issue, and wondering how to help create a wider understanding of that liberty. These are in the future, right? We had a common law passed, say in the 1820s, 1830s, even in the 1880s. There were many common law things that were rights of occupation. For example, you had a right to do any innocent, harmless calling that you want, without having anybody demand that you ask them or petition them for permission to do that. Right? That was called a common law occupation. We don't have that today, and the League says. At the hand of its director, who is a former academician, Michael Hill, who lives in Killen, Alabama. He is a scholar and a Southerner, a very well-informed, very well-read man who believes in the South. He's a kind of a Southern nationalist in the sense he believes that there should be a nation in the South. I think there should not be. I don't believe in nations. I think nations are something temporary, right? There's something on the way of mankind toward future developments which are non-political. In other words, nations imply the necessity of statute and law. But we don't have to have those, though I do think there always is God's law. God enforces his law, whether nation statutes reflect that or not. And he does that by bringing and allowing mass injustice. This writer, Hill, says, the U.S. government is an organized criminal enterprise that it is cannot be doubted by anyone who is kept abreast of the ongoing broad open daylight effort to loot the country's wealth. The multiple $1 trillion worth of bailouts, the related schemes have enriched even further the money men, as he calls them, who pull the strings that animate the politicians, and the fleecing shows no sign of abatement. In case you're wondering why this is being allowed to happen, remember this: your congressmen and senators don't work for you. Rather, they work for those who fill their campaign coffers and make election and re-election politics. This is kind of pretty routine discussion. But he quotes John C. Calhoun, the great Southern philosopher, and who said that the Constitution is inanimate and it is incapable of enforcing itself. Rather, he said, it is up to people in their capacity as citizens of the several sovereign states. He believes in sovereignty, again, residing with the states, to make sure it is enforced. And he said to us, to his readers, only power can check power. And he proposes resistance, and resistance in the ideas of the League of the South is towards separation, toward breaking apart the Leviathan. It won't break apart by force. It really can't be pushed. It's something that will have to break apart internally, and that will be probably through a funding collapse and a loss of confidence in the paper money economy, which is largely, about a quarter of the economy, the American economy today, is purely illusionary. There's no real value there. It is simply part of the financialized sector of the economy. He says the current crop of domestic terrorists will not stop looting our wealth and our inheritance of liberty until we make them stop. It's that simple. We Southerners ought to be first to resist. Such audacity, he says, is in our blood, but what can we do in the face of such irresistible power? He says, first, we can psychologically withdraw our consent from the criminal class that rules over us. Our system is supposedly based on the consent of the governed. If you believe it still is, then withdraw your consent. Not even the hardest tyranny can exist without the support of the drawers of water and hewers of wood, to use an old Irish example. That's actually in the scriptures. Once we withdraw our consent psychologically, then we can begin to withdraw it physically. Simply put, don't work for them in any capacity, and don't give them anything that you can keep out of their thieving hands. Don't patronize their institutions. Don't vote for anyone who runs in their pack. In other words, voting is illusory. And I think Hill is right. Remember, they're robbing you, he says, and your posterity, blind under color of law and without fear of reprisal. Make them earn what they steal for you. Then he says, well, we have the states who are the bulwark against centralized tyranny out of Washington, and he's right. But, of course, they've been bought off. And he mentions in one essay called Serfdom, Revolution, or Independence, which is a very fine piece of writing, he says that sheriffs are the principal peace officer in any jurisdiction in the U.S., and he can lawfully tell the feds to go to hell and stay out of his territory. He can also deputize as many of the county citizens as he wishes and have them armed to the teeth. No one can overrule him within his boundaries. And that's true. We have Sheriff Jim Hammond here. But again, is there desire for that here? And the answer is not yet, or, well, no now, and not yet. And militias, the League of the South in this editorial does not favor them except as a last resort. If your state and local officials refuse to serve the citizens and to protect them by the historic means of nullification, interposition, or secession, then you may have reached the last resort, he says. In that case, you have no alternative except to bow to the will of your masters. Every free man and woman should exercise their rights as expressed in the Second Amendment. Moreover, they should be prepared to defend themselves, he says, and their families from actions that jeopardize life, liberty, and property. When political alternatives are no longer available, this is how it boils down. And he says, let us hope that we never reach this point. And that's someone who doesn't want there to be any kind of warfare, any kind of bloodshed. That's the last thing that the League of the South wants. And these are very devout Christian people, by and large. Some have kind of a cultural interest, some are just conservatives. But they have this perspective of understanding where we stand politically, and and economically. And again, his position is, the League of the South's position is, I think, representing people like you, right? It's a very libertarian position, very sympathetic to Christianity, is that we are under a subjugation, and it's out of Washington. So it really doesn't matter that Trump says right things about the Charlottesville uproar. He has said some very good things about it, and I think he's right in much of what he says. And but he represents a government that doesn't understand its limitations legally, and that it is a kind of revolutionary government. That's what we live under, is a revolutionary government. So in light of that assertion, if it's true, how do we think in terms of local economy and free market? How do we organize ourselves, if we need to be organized at all? How do we separate ourselves from the dependence that it has created in our breast, in our hearts? We are dependent upon it for many, many things. Does that have to be so? Does that have to continue? That's what I'm wondering.
The Tennessee Valley's news, talk, and sports leader.